Good day all. This talk will look at how the criminal justice system works from the viewpoint of sociology's four theoretical approaches. First of all, structuralists see the justice system as a social structure, charged with the function of providing society with law and order. More precisely, it is a system of three interlocking structures: police, courts, and corrections. The police catch criminals, the courts sentence them, and the corrections system carries out those sentences. As a whole, the justice system formalizes and enforces society's norms and values. Anyone who breaks society's laws gets dealt with by the criminal justice system. The justice system is a vital part of society because without law and order, society would fall apart. However, structuralists also argue that there is a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the justice system, because it is charged with performing two services which are often contradictory: providing justice for the general public and providing justice for offenders. On the one hand, the general public has the right to expect certain things from the justice system, above all, protection from crime and retribution for crime. But on the other hand, offenders are also a part of society and also have rights, such as the right to a presumption of innocence until proven guilty, the right to a fair trial, the right not to suffer cruel and unusual punishment, and so on. In other words, the justice system is charged with both punishing offenders and protecting offenders. This inevitably leads to conflict between those whose job focuses on one side and those whose job focuses on the other side. This conflict has been described as being between those who see the justice system in terms of a crime control model and those who see it in terms of a due process model. Those who adopt the crime control model see the job of the justice system as being to control crime by any and all means necessary. Those who adopt the due process model see the justice system as an organization which processes offenders according to established and impartial rules, regulations, and procedures. The crime control supporters see their job as being to get criminals off the streets, which means gaining convictions. And if they have to bend some rules to get those convictions, so be it. The due process supporters say that following the rules is the only way to ensure that justice is done. The due process supporters really do have a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The crime control supporters say that they do, but in practice they tend to have a presumption of guilt unless proven innocent. Similarly, due process supporters focus on offenders' rights and on their rehabilitation, while crime control supporters focus on repression and punishment of offenders. Providing a fair balance between these two sides is very difficult. Structuralists tend to believe that the justice system does a good job of balancing the two. Marxists are not so sure. Marxists argue that the crime control model is the one that serves the interests of the ruling class better because it strengthens their rule over society, and so that is the model that predominates. American Marxist Jeffrey Ryman has argued that our criminal justice system is the way it is because it meets the need of the ruling class for more power and more wealth. It gives them power because the police provide a structure of organized force which can be used against the working class at any time should it try to take a stand against capitalist rule through collective action like protest marches or strikes. And it gives them wealth because, particularly since its partial privatization in the 80s, the corrections system has been turned into a prison industry, whose main function, like that of all industries, is to make the capitalists who run it ever richer. It does this by putting more and more poor people into prison. Justice is supposed to be impartial, but in practice the justice system is biased against the poor, and most of those who end up in prison are poor. The system turns the poor into commodities, which are then warehoused in prisons like unsold products. This process dehumanizes and brutalizes inmates, making them more likely to continue with the life of crime. Capitalism manufactures crime and then manufactures prisons as a so-called solution to the crime problem. But this solution only makes the problem worse. The only thing it improves is corporate profits. Ryman argues that the class bias for the rich and against the poor extends throughout our justice system. The main focus of the system is always on street crime, the crimes of the poor. It largely ignores the crimes of the rich, corporate crime or sweet crime, even though they cost society far more. This also gives society at large the impression that most criminals come from the poor, not the rich. This serves an ideological purpose for capitalism. It casts the working class as society's bad guys and the capitalist class as society's good guys. In short, Ryman argues that the justice system serves the interests of the ruling class in both objective and subjective ways. I would agree with Ryman's analysis, but I would argue that it doesn't tell the whole story. Our justice system does not just meet the need of the rich and powerful for more wealth and power. Subjectivists have argued that certainly it can do so, particularly when authority figures apply negative labels to minority groups. However, they have argued that it also meets a subjective need for the general public, the need for retribution, or more bluntly, revenge. In popular culture, we're told over and over that there is a fine line between justice and revenge. For example, on TV shows, people who have had someone close to them killed by a criminal are generally portrayed as being fully justified in going after that criminal, punishing them, even killing them. In cop shows, sometimes the criminals go to prison, but often they're just killed. The desire to hurt someone who hurt you is a natural one, and it is reinforced by our culture. But the problem with it is that it's a vicious circle. Pain leads to more pain. Violence leads to more violence. And punishment leads to more crime. To change this, we ultimately need to change the way our society thinks about crime and about criminal justice. It is easy to demonize criminals, to portray them as inhuman monsters the way a million cop shows have. And some are. But the media present the exception as the rule, because that makes the show more dramatic and more entertaining. In the real world, as the subjectivists have argued, The majority of criminals are just ordinary people who have found themselves in difficult circumstances and made a choice that seemed like a good idea at the time, but which led them into crime and even into prison. It is much more difficult to forgive than to demand vengeance. But I would argue that this is what we need to do. Punishing criminals only makes them more criminal. If we really want to reduce crime rates, then we need to do the exact opposite. We need to help criminals. We need to provide inmates with programming, with job skills, with job opportunities. We need to provide legitimate means for them to solve their life problems, or as Robert Merton would say, to attain their life goals. And I would argue also that our criminal justice system needs a greater emphasis on restorative justice. We not only need to help offenders, we need to help victims. Indeed, as we saw, women in particular are often victims first, offenders second. If there had been more help for them when they were victims, perhaps they would not have gone on to become offenders. Feminists argue that since the majority of those in the corrections system are men, women have always been treated by that system as an afterthought. Through most of Canada's history, female inmates were housed in male prisons, in attics or whatever spare space was available, which generally meant in atrocious living conditions. This, of course, also meant that they were guarded by male guards, which led to both physical and sexual abuse. In addition, patriarchal attitudes led male guards to treat all female inmates like silly little girls, ordering them around and denying them any adult respect whatsoever. This belittling and infantilization constitutes psychological and emotional abuse, which in turn can lead to behavioral problems upon release. When pressure from the women's movement led to the building of women's prisons, such as Kingston Prison for Women, known as P4W, they turned out to be stone fortresses apparently modelled on medieval dungeons. The building of these maximum security prisons for women who were almost all guilty of non-violent crimes and who were a minimal escape risk was immediately condemned by feminists. Since most of these women had been forced to break the law, either by poverty or by male violence, what they needed was not punishment, but healing and rehabilitation. This could be better provided by moving them out of cell blocks and into bungalow-style housing where they could feel safe and regain some independence and control over their own lives. The federal government did have some such housing built, but only for a minority of female inmates. However, P4W was shut down in the year 2000 and replaced by a more decentralized corrections system for women. The importance of this is that it allows women to retain contact with their families. Separating mothers from children is traumatic for both mothers and children, far more so than separating fathers from their children. Some prisons do now allow young children to stay with their incarcerated mothers, but again, only for a minority. Feminists have argued that with the exception of that small minority of female offenders who have committed violent crimes, all other women inmates should have their prison sentences replaced with sentences served in the community and should be released from prison on the grounds that it is doing them and their families far more harm than good. This is an argument that I fully agree with. Indeed, it is an argument that I would apply not just to women, but to all inmates. Prisons should be for violent offenders only. all other sentences should consist of community service only. Canada currently has a prison population of close to 40,000. While about 2/3 of those inmates are there for violent offences, most of those constitute drunken brawling rather than cold-blooded violence. Drunken brawling should be dealt with through detox centres and anger management courses, not prison. Only about 800 inmates in Canada carry the official designation of dangerous offender. This, I would argue, is more like what the size of Canada's prison population should be. Around 1,000, not 40,000. Prison should be for dangerous offenders only. The rest should be doing community service. The benefits to this would be many. Rates of crime, recidivism, and violence would drop. Most prisons would be closed, and so billions of taxpayers' dollars could be diverted to other chronically underfunded areas like healthcare. Thousands of offenders would not be traumatized and brutalized by the prison experience. Restitution programs would benefit the victims, and community service would benefit the community. In short, offenders, victims, the local community, and society as a whole would all benefit. All it would take is a government initiative to reform our justice system. Now, at the moment, Canada's Liberal government appears to be committed to positive prison reform. For example, Liberal politician Michael Ignatieff has said, quote, "I'm utterly unsentimental about criminals, but one thing I know about prison, it's that prison makes almost everybody worse who's in there." And so the Liberal government claims to be liberalising penal policy by introducing a greater focus on rehabilitation into our corrections system. However, studies have shown that this commitment is more appearance than reality. For example, the Liberals promised to eliminate the use of solitary confinement in Canada's prisons, but its use remains widespread. In practice, little has changed, and the infliction of mass punishment remains the system's main goal. The Liberals are liberal in name only. Perhaps someday we shall have a government that promises positive prison reform and actually means it. Perhaps. But in recent years, progress here in Canada has come less from politicians than from citizens' groups, particularly Indigenous leaders concerned with the high incarceration rate of Indigenous people in Canada. They have reintroduced the ancient tribal justice practice of the sentencing circle into the modern justice system. If one person has offended against another, all of the affected parties gather under the authority of a judge to discuss the situation and work out an agreement that all sides can accept. This model rejects the current adversarial process used in courts, arguing that justice should not be about establishing winners and losers, but about establishing a compromise in which everybody wins. Offenders can provide recompense to victims, thereby allowing forgiveness and cutting off a potential cycle of anger and violence. Tribal societies had no room for lingering resentments, and neither should modern societies. The federal government has provided some support for this initiative, but only up to a point. The Scandinavian countries have gone much further in reforming their justice systems, particularly their corrections system. Their focus really is on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Prison conditions are better, relations with staff are better, and educational programs are provided to give the inmates job skills they can use upon release. Prisons there are real schools rather than schools of crime, as ours are. The result in Scandinavia has been declining crime rates, declining recidivism rates, and declining incarceration rates. Rehabilitation is not just more humane than punishment, it is also much more effective. So, to conclude, let me ask the question: can the criminal justice system ever eliminate crime? Well, personally, I very much doubt it. But let me rephrase that question and ask, can we significantly reduce crime rates? Yes, I believe that we can, but we're not going to do it by continuing to deal with crime the way that we have been doing. Our present justice system not only fails to prevent crime, it actually creates crime in a variety of ways, such as making prisons into schools of crime. If crime is a solution to criminals' life problems, then the way to prevent crime is to provide alternative, legitimate solutions to those problems. The Scandinavian countries do this, and the result has been a major decline in crime rates. But here in North America, our criminal justice system not only does very little to help inmates with their problems, it piles on a whole new set of problems caused by things like institutionalization, prison violence, and a criminal record. While there is a violent minority of criminals who need to be incarcerated, most criminals are victims of their social circumstances. This is why the way to reduce crime is not through more repression, more law and order, and more people in prison. The way to reduce crime is to provide alternatives to crime. Our government needs to find ways to help criminals solve their life problems without turning to crime. Creating jobs, providing social programs and education, reducing poverty and unemployment. These are social measures that will do far more to reduce crime rates than filling our prisons to overflowing. In the past, North America's indigenous people had a justice system based on healing and rehabilitation. In the present, Scandinavia also has such a system. But in present-day North America, we have a justice system that pretends to be about rehabilitation, but is actually about punishment and brutalization. It doesn't have to be this way, and it's time that it stopped being this way. Punishment is not really about justice, it's about revenge. And revenge is a vicious circle, often a circle of violence. State-sanctioned violence leads to individual violence. Prisons are schools of violence as well as schools of crime. Only by abandoning our current emphasis on prisons and punishment in favor of one on education and rehabilitation can we ever hope to reduce crime rates and come to live in a safer and more law-abiding society. Whether North America will ever elect politicians who are smart enough and humane enough to introduce such policies remains to be seen. A copy of a transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day all.